In 2008, $19 trillion disappeared. Not stolen by hackers, not lost in a war, just gone. And here's the crazy part. It didn't vanish overnight. It took 5 years to build the trap. Millions of people walked right into it. And when it finally snapped shut, the people who built it got paid. Not punished, paid. This is the story of the biggest financial heist in history. And the wildest part, you can trace every dollar. From your neighbor's house to Wall Street's boardrooms to the pockets of people who are still running the system today. To understand how the world economy collapsed, you first have to understand what Americans wanted more than anything else: a house. For decades, that's how you built wealth in America. You buy a house, you make your payments, the house goes up in value, you retire, you pass it to your kids. Simple, reliable, the American dream. And for most of the 20th century, getting a mortgage was pretty straightforward. You walk into your local bank, you sit down with a loan officer, they look at your tax returns, your pay stubs, your credit score. Can you actually afford this house? If yes, here's your loan. It was called a prime mortgage. Good credit, steady income, a decent down payment, usually 20%. The bank kept your mortgage on their books. If you stopped paying, they lost money. So they were careful, really careful. This system worked for generations. It was boring, it was safe, and honestly, there wasn't a lot of money to be made beyond the interest on the loan. Then Wall Street looked at this system and asked a question. What if we could make more money from this? Here's what they figured out. Instead of one bank holding one mortgage, what if you could take thousands of mortgages and bundle them together? Like literally pool them, mix them up, turn them into a bond. This is called a mortgage-backed security, an MBS. Here's how it works. You take 1,000 mortgages from all over the country, different people, different houses, different risk levels. You bundle them together into one big security, then you slice that security into pieces and sell those pieces to investors. The idea makes sense, actually. It's diversification. If one person in Ohio stops paying their mortgage, no big deal. The other 999 people are still paying. The investors still get their monthly returns. And for the bank that made the original loan, they can sell it immediately, get their money back, make more loans. More loans equals more fees equals more profit. For a while, this system worked great, especially with safe, traditional mortgages. But then someone had an idea. What about all the people who can't qualify for normal mortgages? That's millions of potential customers. And that's when things got interesting. In the early 2000s, Wall Street started pushing something called subprime mortgages. Subprime just means higher risk, lower credit scores, less stable income, smaller down payments. In theory, that's fine. Some people are riskier borrowers, they pay a higher interest rate, the math balances out. But here's where it gets clever. To make these loans attractive to people who couldn't normally afford them, the banks created something called an adjustable rate mortgage with a teaser rate. You get a super low interest rate for the first 2 or 3 years, maybe 3%. Your monthly payments are totally manageable. But buried in the fine print is a reset clause. After 2 years, that 3% rate jumps, sometimes to 7%, sometimes to 9%, sometimes higher. Your $1,200 monthly payment suddenly becomes $2,500. Now, you're probably thinking, that sounds like a disaster waiting to happen. And you'd be right. But the pitch to borrowers was simple. Don't worry, house prices always go up. In 2 years, your house will be worth way more. You can refinance before the rate adjusts, or just sell and make a profit. And for a few years, that pitch actually worked. Between 2000 and 2006, housing prices went up a lot.
If you bought a house in 2002, by 2004 it was worth 15% more. By 2006, maybe 30% more. People were making money just by owning a house. They weren't doing anything, just watching the value climb. So they started treating their houses like ATMs. Refinance, take out a home equity loan, buy a bigger house, flip properties. Everyone was winning. Homeowners were getting rich, banks were making fees, Wall Street was packaging these mortgages into securities and selling them worldwide, and the world was buying. Pension funds, insurance companies, foreign governments. Why? Because these mortgage-backed securities had the best ratings possible. Here's a critical part of the story. When you create the mortgage-backed security, you need someone to evaluate it. Is it safe? Is it risky? What's the rating? That's the job of the credit rating agencies, the big three, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch. They rate these securities from AAA, which means super safe, down to junk, which means very risky. And here's what happened. They gave AAA ratings to securities that were packed full of subprime mortgages. The same rating as U.S. Treasury bonds, the safest investment on earth. Why would they do that? Well, here's the thing. The banks creating these securities paid the rating agencies to rate them. So if Moody's gave you a bad rating, you could just go to Standard & Poor's or Fitch. The agencies were competing for business, and the banks were their customers. It's like if restaurants paid health inspectors to give them good ratings. You can see how that creates a problem. But at the time, everyone trusted the ratings. So investors all over the world bought these mortgage-backed securities thinking they were safe. By 2005, there was massive demand for these securities.
Investors wanted more. Wall Street was making billions. But there was a problem. To create more securities, they needed more mortgages. So Wall Street told the mortgage lenders, "We'll buy everything you can produce. Just keep 'em coming." And the lenders thought, okay, let's make more loans. But there's a limit to how many qualified borrowers exist. So they started lowering their standards. Income verification? Optional. Down payment? Not necessary. Checking if someone can actually afford the loan? We'll skip that. They created something called ninja loans. No income, no job, no assets. Sounds insane, right? But here's a real example. A farm worker in California making $14,000 a year was approved for a $720,000 mortgage. That's more than 50 times his annual income. The math doesn't work. It could never work. Everyone involved knew it. But the lender didn't care. Why? Because they weren't keeping the loan. As soon as the paperwork was signed, they sold it to Wall Street, got their origination fee, moved on to the next loan. The risk? That's Wall Street's problem now. This is called originate to distribute. Make the loan, sell it immediately, collect your fee, repeat. It completely broke the incentive structure. Normally, if you make a bad loan, you lose money, so you're careful. But if you sell the loan in 3 days, you have zero incentive to make sure it's a good loan. You just want volume. Okay, so Wall Street is bundling thousands of mortgages into securities and selling them to investors. But even in a bundle of 1,000 mortgages, some are riskier than others. When you slice up a mortgage-backed security, you create different layers, different tranches. The top tranches are the safest. They get paid first. The bottom tranches are riskier. They take the first losses if people default. Nobody wanted the bottom tranches. Too risky. So Wall Street invented something brilliant and insane. The CDO, Collateralized Debt Obligation. Here's what they did. They took the riskiest tranches from multiple mortgage-backed securities, the stuff nobody wanted, and they bundled them together into a new security. Then they sliced that new security into tranches.
And somehow, the top tranche of this new CDO got rated as safe, even though it was literally made from the garbage parts of other securities. It's like taking burnt pieces from 10 different pizzas, stacking them together, and calling the top layer gourmet. But the math was complex, the models looked sophisticated, and the rating agencies gave these CDOs high ratings, so investors bought them. Everyone was making money, the party was roaring, and then, quietly, the music started to stop. Remember those adjustable rate mortgages with the teaser rates? The ones where the rate jumps after 2 years? In late 2006, millions of those loans started hitting their reset dates.
People who had $1,200 monthly payments suddenly owed $2,400 or $2,800, and they couldn't afford it. They tried to refinance, but housing prices had stopped going up. In some markets, they were going down. So they couldn't refinance and they couldn't sell, which meant they started defaulting. At first, it was just a few thousand people, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. The defaults were spreading, and most people on Wall Street didn't notice, but a few people did. While Wall Street was still partying, a small group of investors started reading the actual loan documents. One of them was Michael Burry. He was a doctor who became a hedge fund manager. Kind of an odd guy, brilliant with numbers. And he did something almost nobody else was doing. He read the mortgages. Not the summaries, not the sales pitches, the actual mortgage documents backing these securities. And what he found shocked him. Loans to people with no income verification, adjustable rates about to reset, houses in markets where prices were already falling. He realized these securities are going to fail massively. So he came up with a plan. He wanted to bet against them. Burry went to the big Wall Street banks and said, "I want to buy insurance on these mortgage bonds." The banks created something for him, a credit default swap. Here's how it worked. Burry would pay the bank a quarterly fee, like an insurance premium. In return, if the mortgage bonds failed, the bank would pay him a huge amount of money. The banks thought he was crazy. They were so confident these bonds were safe, they saw this as free money. It's like selling fire insurance on a building you think is fireproof. So they took the deal, happily. And Burry wasn't alone. A guy named Steve Eisman and his team saw the same thing. They met mortgage brokers who were bragging about giving loans to people who could never pay them back. They realized the whole system was rotten. So they started buying the same insurance, credit default swaps on mortgage-backed securities. But here's the problem. For their bet to pay off, the housing market had to crash. And in 2005 and 2006, it didn't. Housing prices kept going up. The bonds looked fine. Meanwhile, Burry and Eisman were paying millions in premiums every quarter. Burry's investors got angry. Some of them sued him. Eisman's bosses questioned whether he'd lost his mind. Everyone thought they were wrong. And then the dominoes started falling. This is where things get wild. If you're finding this breakdown valuable, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because what happens next is one of the craziest sequences in financial history, and you don't want to miss it. By early 2007, the defaults were piling up. All across America, people were walking away from their mortgages. The bonds that were supposed to be safe were failing. But here's the insane part. The banks and the rating agencies refused to admit it. They kept valuing these toxic securities as if they were still fine. Why? Because if they admitted the truth, they'd have to admit they were broke. Burry's insurance policies should have been worth a fortune, but the banks wouldn't pay out. It's like watching a building burn down and having the insurance company say, "That building looks fine to us." But the cracks were spreading. In March 2008, Bear Stearns collapsed. Bear Stearns was one of the oldest investment banks on Wall Street, and in 5 days, they went from "everything's fine" to "we're bankrupt." The government stepped in and forced J.P. Morgan Chase to buy them for $2 a share.
$2, a company that had been worth billions. Everyone took a breath. Maybe that was the worst of it. It wasn't. Monday, September 15, 2008, Lehman Brothers, a 158-year-old Wall Street giant, declared bankruptcy, the largest bankruptcy in American history, and the financial system froze. Here's why. Every major bank was holding the same toxic garbage. They all knew it, but nobody knew how much anyone else was holding. So the banks stopped lending to each other. If you don't know whether the bank across the street is going to exist tomorrow, you don't lend them money today. Credit markets froze. Companies couldn't borrow money to make payroll. Normal business stopped. But the real panic came the next day. AIG, the largest insurance company in the world, was about to collapse. Why? Because they were on the other side of all those credit default swaps. AIG had sold insurance on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of mortgage bonds, and now, all at once, everyone was demanding payment. But AIG didn't have the money. If AIG collapsed, every major bank in the world would go down with them. This was the moment the entire global financial system was about to implode. The government had a choice: let the system collapse or bail it out. The Treasury Secretary at the time was a guy named Hank Paulson, former CEO of Goldman Sachs. He proposed a plan, a $700 billion bailout. The argument was simple and terrifying. Give us the money or the entire economy collapses. Your ATM stops working. Your employer can't make payroll. Your savings disappear. Pay the ransom or lose everything. Congress was furious. The public was furious. But they paid. $700 billion went to the banks. Officially, it was to buy up toxic assets and stabilize the system. But here's what actually happened.
The money went straight to the bank's balance sheets. It plugged the holes they'd created. And less than a year later, those same banks paid out $140 billion in executive bonuses. The people who crashed the economy got bonuses. Here's the part that should make you angry. Of all the executives at the major banks that caused the crisis, not one went to prison. Not one. Angelo Mazzillo, the CEO of Countrywide, the biggest subprime lender, he paid a fine, kept hundreds of millions. Dick Fuld, the CEO of Lehman Brothers, no charges. The executives at Bear Stearns, Merrill Lynch, AIG, no criminal prosecutions. They walked away. Some of them retired with 9-figure fortunes. Meanwhile, 10 million American families lost their homes. The unemployment rate doubled. Trillions in retirement savings vanished. The people who caused the crisis got paid. The people who suffered paid the bill. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but they fixed the system, right? This can't happen again. Well, let me show you what's happening right now. But first, if you want to understand how the game actually works, hit subscribe, because what I'm about to show you is still happening today. After 2008, some rules changed. The Dodd-Frank Act created new regulations. Banks had to hold more capital. There was more oversight. But here's what didn't change. The banks got bigger. J.P. Morgan Chase bought Bear Stearns. Bank of America bought Merrill Lynch. Wells Fargo bought Wachovia. The banks that were too big to fail in 2008 are even bigger now. In 2008, the top 5 banks controlled 40% of all banking assets. Today, they control over 50%. They're bigger, more powerful, more connected to the government. And the fundamental incentive structure? Still broken. Executives still get massive bonuses for short-term profits. If things go well, they get rich. If things go bad, the taxpayer bails them out. They still win either way. Remember Michael Burry, the guy who bet against the housing market? He made about $100 million personally. His fund made $700 million for his investors. He was right. He saw it coming. He bet against the system. And after it was over, he said something interesting. I may have been early, but I wasn't wrong. The system is still broken.
Steve Eisman's team made a fortune too, but there was no celebration. They watched the world economy collapse in real time. They profited from a disaster they tried to warn people about, and they knew it could happen again. So what happened to the money? $19 trillion in wealth disappeared between 2007 and 2009, but it didn't vanish into thin air.
Some of it was fictional. Housing prices that were inflated, stock values that were fake. That wealth never really existed, but a lot of it got transferred. From homeowners to banks, from taxpayers to executives, from the middle class to the wealthy. The bailout money didn't disappear. It's sitting in bank balance sheets and executive compensation packages. The houses that people lost in foreclosure, banks sold them, often to private equity firms. The retirement savings that evaporated, that money moved to people who shorted the market, to people who bet on the collapse. The money didn't vanish, it just changed hands, from the many to the few. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The conditions that created 2008 still exist. Housing prices are at all-time highs again, in many markets higher than 2006. Student loan debt is now $1.7 trillion. It's packaged into securities and sold to investors. Sound familiar? Corporate debt is at record levels. Much of it is rated as safe, even though the companies are barely profitable. The same pattern, different products. And the banks, they're bigger and more powerful than ever. The people who run them learned a lesson from 2008. Not don't do risky things, but make sure you're too big to fail. Because if you're too big to fail, you can take huge risks. If it works, you get rich. If it doesn't, the government bails you out. You can't lose. The story of 2008 isn't really about mortgages or derivatives or credit default swaps. It's about incentives. When people can profit from risk without facing the consequences of failure, they'll take bigger and bigger risks. When banks can gamble with other people's money and keep the winnings, they'll gamble. When executives get massive bonuses for short-term profits and no punishment for long-term disaster, they'll chase short-term profits. The system isn't broken by accident. It's designed this way. And until the incentives change, the pattern will repeat. The 2008 financial crisis wasn't a random accident. It was a predictable result of broken incentives. And those incentives still exist today. If you want to understand how money and power actually work, subscribe to this channel, because I break down the patterns they don't teach you in school. The contracts are public, the numbers are documented, the pattern is clear. And the more people who understand it, the harder it is for them to do it again. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments, do you think the system is any safer today? And check out the next video on your screen for more breakdowns like this.